Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But actually, there were many more than that. There might have been dozens. Like the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Philip, just to mention a few. There wasn't one early Christianity, there were many.
One faith for many. Christianity grew explosively. From Jerusalem to Asia Minor and Egypt, Rome and North Africa. There were no churches yet. Instead, followers met in private homes, where some heard gospels named for people that would surprise most churchgoers today.
Some used Philip, some used Thomas, some used the Gospel of Mary, others used Matthew or Mark or Luke or John.
Some of the early Christians are now called Gnostics, or the people who knew.
The Gnostics were mystics. That is to say, they were people that felt they could have some kind of direct access to God. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. But this kind of knowledge is not everyday knowledge. It is not book learning. It is insight. It is intuition. It is that ability to know something about yourself, to know that you have a spark of the divine inside of you, and to recognize the God that you profess to be, the God that is outside, is the same as that spark of the divine that is within you. And many of the Gnostics were Christian.
Gnostics are the people who wrote most of the texts known as the Nag Hammadi Library. Their stories about Christ are much more abstract and philosophical than those of the New Testament. One favorite was the Gospel of Thomas. Is real. But no one really knows how old it is. Only radiocarbon dating can prove it. It turns out to carbon date something, you have to destroy it. Or at least part of it. To date the gospel, they must take samples from its pages and leather binding. Radiocarbon dating expert Dr. Timothy Joel and Professor Kasser choose the places to sample, careful to avoid any letters. Now Madame Dao does what for her is unthinkable. Taking a knife to a document she's so painstakingly restored.
When I had to cut a piece of papyrus, I have to say I wasn't too pleased, because I spend my time trying to replace the little pieces.
Five tiny samples from the Codex now travel from 6,000 miles to the University of Arizona's Physics Center. Here, Dr. Joe what some early church fathers maybe wish they had.
I will have to burn the gospel.
It's like a clock that ticks backwards. Scientists know how much carbon-14 is in the papyrus now. By using the clock, they can figure out the approximate date the papyrus was harvested. The results are in. The truth is in the numbers.
Radiocarbon dating of the papyrus, which is from the Gospel of Judas, confirms that it's from the 3rd to the 4th century AD. And this supports the authenticity of the Gospel of Judas.
Radiocarbon dating proves for the first time that the document dates from 280 AD, plus or minus 50 years. That How could Judas Iscariot be worthy of secret knowledge? In these broken pages, a radical new portrait of Judas comes to life. Is the Lost Gospels portrait of Judas really so different from the New Testament account? In fact, Judas wasn't always portrayed as a villain. He grows more evil from the first Gospel, Mark, to the last, John.
The Gospel of Mark was written about the year 60 and is, of course, considered by most scholars to be the earliest Gospel. He has about one-third as many references to Judas as does, say, John. But the way the act of Judas is portrayed is most striking. Judas is not a villain in Mark's Gospel.
This is called the Upper Room, after a reference in the Gospel of Mark. According to tradition, it's where Jesus and the apostles held the Last Supper. Dr. William Clausen has spent much of his professional life trying to understand the Gospel's portrait of Judas. In Mark's account of what happened in this room, the focus is not on Judas.
The intimacy of that scene cannot be overemphasized. I mean, it's a very close encounter between Jesus and his disciples. And for Jesus to bring in the note that his end is near must have been very painful to them.
In Mark's Last Supper, Judas is not pointed out as the betrayer. But by Matthew, the next gospel to be written, his guilt is never in doubt.
The Gospel of Matthew seemed to be written some 10 or 12 years after Mark. Matthew seems to put some guilt on Judas's shoulders.
The betrayal takes place in the Garden of Gethsemane, just outside Jerusalem's walls. Judas identifies Jesus to the waiting soldiers with history's most famous kiss.
According to Matthew's Gospel, when Judas heard that Jesus had gone from Caiaphas to Pilate, he was despondent. Judas left that place, and knowing that Jesus would surely die in the hands of Pilate, he committed suicide.
In another New Testament account,
The fact is that the Gospels do become increasingly anti-Jewish as the movement becomes more and more Gentile. And that has had enormous effect on the history of Christianity and on the world, even to the 20th and the 21st century.
Unfortunately,
Judas becomes the poster boy for anti-Semitic thinking. And unfortunately,